Hello again. So now we're going to be talking about using the theory of planned behavior to predict a certain type of behavior. Um, it's not predicting whether somebody uses ecstasy or not, right? It's, it's predicting, it's being used to predict whether ecstasy users will implement harm reduction strategies. Um, And so that's the focus of this article, just to be clear. We're not trying to target a very habitual, habit-forming type of behavior. It's trying to engage ecstasy users in safe strategies for using ecstasy, or at least safer, right? A reduction of harm uh, is really important when dealing with some of these very strong habitual behaviors, habit-forming behaviors. Okay, let's see. So this is the Davidson-Rosenberg article you were assigned to read this week. They do target and they do examine the ecstasy effects, and so some of these can be quite pleasant, I guess, to the users. It enhances mood. It increases the sense of energy, sociability, self-confidence, stress reduction, sexual enhancement, and a sense of subjective well-being. Okay. On the negative side, though, ecstasy effects include dehydration, elevated body temperature, a raising heartbeat, nausea, teeth clenching, grinding, dizziness, muscle aches or tension, sleeplessness, fatigue, confusion, anxiety, fear, paranoia, and even some long-term effects regarding these last three. Okay. And so those negative effects are quite serious. And so there are harm reduction strategies for ecstasy users. They fall into two categories. One is the consuming prescription or over-the-counter medications to help reduce serotonin depletion or to help replace nutrients lost during intoxication episodes. And so some of these over-the-counter or prescription meds would be the 5-HTP, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, one example of those being Zoloft, one of the very recognizable type of reuptake inhibitors. Herbal supplements such as St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba also would be used to help deal with some of the depletion or serotonin depletion, or to help replace nutrients, such as using multivitamins or antioxidant supplements. Okay, so most of the support for this type of preloading or post-loading as a harm reduction strategy has come from animal studies. So the evidence is still out in terms of human effects, but these are kind of things that are being recommended right now based on what we know about the effects in animals with these different strategies. Okay, a second harm reduction strategy was the pill testing, pill checking. And so basically this involves purchasing testing kits or using online databases that help check for the presence of adulterants in ecstasy. And these adulterants might include innocuous effects such as that from caffeine. It might also include substances that are dangerous, potentially dangerous. such as other types of drugs mixed with ecstasy, such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, or it might include some MDMA analogs. These analogs are substituted agents believed to elicit typical MDMA-like effects or ecstasy-like effects. Okay. So the pill testing and the pill checking, the online pill checking, the database, might simply help the individual make informed decisions about whether they want to take the substance they purchased or how much of it to take, right? And just basically, should I take it? And if I'm going to take it, if it's adulterated or modified, it has additional things in it that might produce some extreme effects, maybe I want to take a little bit less, right? So all in all, the pill testing, the pill check to reduce negative effects. So both of these require some thinking and planning ahead of time, right, before consuming the ecstasy. And for the most part. And so basically these researchers were wanting to know, will the ecstasy users engage in these type of behaviors depending on their beliefs or the theory of planned behavior beliefs that would be guiding their behavior. Okay. Okay, so the purpose of studies is to examine whether the theory of planned behavior constructs are related to, number one, the baseline intention to implement the use of ecstasy-specific harm reduction strategies. Right, so our attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control for harm reduction strategies related to actual baseline intention to preload or postload. Okay. So what are my attitudes toward preloading or postloading? How about subjective? What are my perceived or subjective norms of what others who use ecstasy think about preloading or postloading? And what is my perceived behavioral control over using preload and postload? And so how do these beliefs actually lead to the prediction of my intention to use these harm reduction strategies? So they did that both for preload and postload, preload, postload, and for pill test and pill check. Okay, so they wanted to know how those beliefs related to each of those harm reduction strategies. They also wanted to examine whether the frequency of ecstasy use in prior 3 months, the strength of their use, right, their dependency, was related to baseline intention to preload, postload, and baseline intention to pill test, pill check. So people who have been using a lot in the previous 3 months versus comparing those to people who have been using it less frequently or infrequently in the previous 3 months. How do they differ in their behavioral intentions to use these harm reduction strategies? So the study examined whether the proportion of drug use episodes in which ecstasy consumers implemented harm reduction strategies at 2 months follow-up was predicted by, I'll fix it before I post it. So this is purpose 1, purpose 2, and then this is the third purpose. Okay, so they wanted to know if the proportion of drug use episodes in which ecstasy consumers implemented harm reduction strategies at 2-month follow-up was predicted by the theory of planned behavior constructs, right, of behavioral intention and perceived behavioral control and habit strength. So remember, in the theory of planned behavior, attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control are believed to influence one's behavioral intention to engage in the behavior. In other words, to engage in harm reduction strategies in this particular study, right? But the behavior in the theory of planned behavior is predicted by the behavioral intention and also through a direct effect from perceived behavioral control. So in this part of the study, in this arm of the study, they wanted to see a perceived behavioral control to engage in harm reduction strategies and behavioral intentions to engage in harm reduction strategies actually predicted the behavior of implementing harm reduction strategies 2 months later. Okay? So they're looking across time. At time one, what are people thinking? Okay, what are their attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control? And how do they relate to their behavioral intentions at that baseline? Okay, without any kind of intervention, they went then and followed them up again at 2 months later. And at that 2-month period, they wanted to see if the behavioral intentions reported up front and the perceived behavioral control reported up front at baseline would predict engagement or use of harm reduction strategies at 2 months down the line. Okay? Like, were they actually implementing these harm reduction strategies? Not just talking about their beliefs in relation to those harm reduction strategies. So they examined the two types of strategies, right? The preload, postload. They're taking something to help reduce the harm of ecstasy. And then the pill test or pill check, they're doing their research before taking something that they purchase to make sure it's safe or unadulterated. Okay. And then the third thing they tested at that 2-month follow-up period was whether the habit strength, and I meant to change this, it's not, because they talk about habit strength in relationship to something else, but they wanted to examine the frequency of ecstasy use in the 3 months prior to the baseline and how that was related to actual engagement in harm reduction strategies at 2-month follow-up in the actual behavior. So if someone has a stronger ecstasy habit, are they likely to engage in these harm reduction strategies? Oops, sorry. Okay, so for the methods, I hope you can read this okay, but I will post up the PowerPoint so you can see it fairly easily. So what they did was they recruited ecstasy users via Facebook advertisements. I think they said they had like 4 Facebook advertisements, 4 ads that they posted on Facebook, and people could click on it and, explore what it was about, and decide if they wanted to participate in the study because it led them to the link, right? So the people that they were targeting in their recruitment efforts through their posts or their ads in Facebook included people from multiple geographic areas, different countries where they spoke English. They wanted to focus on adults, so they were only recruiting people who are between the ages of 18 to 65 years. Again, they had to be English speakers. And they had to have consumed ecstasy in the past, at least once in the past 3 months. And they had to plan to consume ecstasy in the next 2 months. So these were people that they were trying to recruit into a study who were regular ecstasy users. Let's see. Some of the previous likes. So these folks typically were recruited or identified because they had submitted previous likes to ecstasy-related Facebook pages. They provided an incentive of $10 in the way of a Starbucks gift card that would be offered to the first 150 people who participated in the study, or some number like that. Again, the 4 ads marketed the study, and the individuals would click on them and they would be directed to the web-based study where they consented. They read the consent form and agreed to participate and continue with the study. Submitted their baseline data. So using the theory of planned behavior constructs for use of harm reduction strategies were assessed at this point, and the level of use of ecstasy. And then also they provided contact information so that they could be followed up at 2 months down the line. So their baseline sample, they ended up with a sample of 391 people completing the baseline survey, online survey. And then at 2 months, they tried to contact all the original people who responded to those links and ended up with 100 people who completed both the baseline and the 2-month follow-up sample. So they only had 100 people who completed the follow-up, the 2-month follow-up. Both samples, both the baseline and the follow-up, were predominantly male, were young, 18 to 24 years of age. The majority were heterosexual, white, single, and most of them lacked a college degree. So they might have had some high school or a little bit of college, but they didn't have a college degree. The measures, again, they measured theory of planned behavior to use harm reduction strategies questionnaire. And so this questionnaire assessed attitudes with 4 items. And so an example of one of those items is pill testing checking is important to me. And then another one would say pill testing checking is beneficial to me. Okay. Subjective norms were assessed with 3 items. A sample item was, most of my ecstasy using friends tell me that I should test or check the content of my pill before I use ecstasy. To assess perceived behavioral control, they included 5 items. An example of one of these is, I can preload, postload when I use ecstasy if I choose to. Okay. And then for behavioral intentions, they included 3 items in their survey. An example would be, I intend to test or check the content of my pill before I use ecstasy in the next 2 months. Right. So this is the math saying these things at the baseline. Again, they responded to all of the items in the survey in this theory of planned behavior on the 7-point Likert type scale, ranging from -3, reflecting strongly disagree, to 3, strongly agree. Other measures included the Index of Habit Strength Questionnaire. And so this included 10 items. And so by habit strength, they're talking the habit of using, these harm reduction strategies. And so here they had 10 items, 5 for the pill test check and 5 for the preload postload. The items assessed how frequently and how automatically an individual had implemented each specific harm reduction strategy in the past. So, for example, an item might read something like, pill testing is something I do frequently. It's just what kind of habits did they engage in terms of these harm reduction strategies. Again, these were rated on the 7-point scale. Another survey included in the study was the Ecstasy and Substance Use History Questionnaire. And again, this was only collected at baseline. And it assessed the lifetime use the past 3 months, the location in which one used, the last time they used, the average number of pills they consumed per occasion, and the number of pills they purchased per transaction, the consumption of other drugs during the past 3 months as well. Okay. So this one was also assessed at, I believe, at the 2-month follow-up. Okay, so, and then they had the Ecstasy Harm Reduction Strategies Questionnaire, and it basically assessed the proportion of occasions that they had used each of the 19 specific ecstasy-specific harm reduction strategies when they consumed ecstasy. And finally, they assessed demographics, which examined age, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, country of residence, education level, and relationship status. So what did they find? So basically they found that attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control for harm reduction strategies were all significantly and positively related with baseline intentions to use harm reduction strategies. So if a person had positive attitudes toward harm reduction strategies, that tended to lead to a high behavioral intention to use harm reduction strategies. If someone reported high subjective norms for incorporating harm reduction strategies, so either they thought others believed they should do it, or they thought others like themselves, other ecstasy users, commonly practice harm reduction strategies, then they were more likely to report high behavioral intentions to use harm reduction strategies. And finally, perceived behavioral control, if they felt capable and able and in control of using these harm reduction strategies, that they reported high levels of this, then they also reported high behavioral intention to use the harm reduction strategies. Okay, that's what a positive relationship is. If one variable is high, then the scores on the other variable is high. It could work the other way as well. If they had low scores on attitudes, and they would also have low scores on behavioral intentions. Okay, so as long as they're in the same direction, it's a positive relationship. Okay, so significantly related just means that it was statistically significant. Okay, so they were significantly and possibly related with baseline intentions to use harm reduction strategy. The previous 3-month frequency of ecstasy use was not related to baseline intentions to use harm reduction strategies. Right? So the strength of use, the frequency of use in the previous 3 months did not predict whether they intended to use behavioral intention, whether they intended to use harm reduction strategies. All right, number 2, baseline habit strengths, right? So that their habitual implementation of these harm reduction strategies, okay, at baseline habit strengths of applying harm reduction strategies were also positively associated with the proportion of time participants use preload, postload harm reduction strategies at 2 months. Okay? So this is a behavioral outcome, right? So their baseline habit strength, whatever they reported at the baseline survey, that what they say, oh yeah, I typically do this prior to taking something. I typically engage in harm reduction strategy, and it comes naturally to me. Those people were more likely to actually engage in the behavior of implementing harm reduction strategies at the 2-month follow-up. Okay, number 3, the frequency of ecstasy consumption prior to baseline was negatively associated with the proportion of time participants use preload, postload harm reduction strategy. Okay, so if they had, so let's say it was negatively associated. So if at baseline they reported a high frequency use of ecstasy, at the 2-month follow-up, they were less likely to report that they were engaging in harm reduction strategies. It's a negative relationship. If it's high on one, it's low on the other. Okay, it's an inverse relationship. That's what a negative relationship is, in case you haven't taken statistics before. Okay. Number 4, baseline baseline habit strengths to apply harm reduction strategies were positively associated with the proportion of time participants used preload, postload harm reduction strategy. Did I repeat that one? How is that different from baseline? Oh, shoot. Sorry. Let me run this again. Sorry about that. Get back to the results. So let me see if number 2 and number 4 are different. Baseline habit strengths to apply were positively associated with the proportion of time participants use preload, post-load harm reduction strategy. So I guess I repeated that by accident. Sorry. So 2 and 4 are the same here. And then number 5, baseline intention to apply harm reduction strategies were positively associated with the proportion of time participants use pill test, pill checking, harm reduction strategy. Okay, so this is the habit of the strength, like how naturally it came to them. It was just their intention to apply harm reduction strategies at baseline tended to positively predict the proportion of times the participants actually used the pill test, pill check, harm reduction strategy at the 2-month follow-up. Baseline intention and perceived behavioral control did not predict preload, postload harm reduction. Preload, postload strategy requires finance. Oh, so why didn't the baseline intentions and perceived behavioral control, why didn't these constructs that are supposed to predict actual behavioral outcomes, why didn't they predict the preload and postload harm reduction strategy, the actual engagement in the behavior of preloading or postloading? And one idea is that engaging in preload and postload strategies would require financial resources. So you would either have to have some kind of prescription to help you to preload right before you took some ecstasy, or you would have to have financial resources to buy those supplements like St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba, I think was the other one. And so people don't have those resources and are only using their financial resources to buy the ecstasy. They're less likely to engage in those preload, postload strategies, okay, or even the supplements, the vitamins and that. And so if they don't have the money for that, then that would be prohibitive to engage in that type of behavior, okay? So the pill test also costs money, but pill check on the internet might not cost money. So maybe that is why the baseline intention did predict that. I'm not sure. But basically, those were the results for this study. Okay. And I'll fix the slide and post it up so that we only have 2 or 4 in here. Okay. I'll probably delete number 2. Okay, so next I'm going to stop this recording because they can only be so large for me to upload. And next I'll record the one for the other article. Okay, see you in a bit.